Hi everyone, it's Ren here. I hope you're doing well and that I'm still somehow presentable in this last incarnation before shaving. um, so today I wanted to talk about philosophy yet again, and more specifically about the problem with philosophy, or at least what I perceive or conceive as the problem with philosophy nowadays, taking a bit of a bird's eye view on the discipline and on its relevance to culture, to the culture. As far as I'm concerned, the culture will be, broadly speaking, tied to the Western world, because that's the perspective from which I consider myself capable of speaking, pertinent, at least in potential. And it seems to me, when I try to take this bird's eye view as someone who writes philosophy from a non-academic perspective, when I say non-academic, I mean that I am not myself an academic philosopher. I'm not a professor of philosophy in a university, or in any tertiary education institution. The bird's eye view that I have, it has flaws and advantages. I think one of the flaws is that in order to remain familiar with what's being done currently, I have to make an extra level of effort in terms of researching content than I probably would need to make if I were an academic philosopher. But at the same time, the big picture view that I can have might not be as susceptible as being influenced by the ivory tower phenomenon of being within a community and not realizing that the world at large is not really following what one is doing. And so my main impression is that really philosophy these days is a discipline that people don't consider to be particularly relevant to their lives. I think on the one hand you have science, on the other you have the hard sciences, on the other you have psychology. Then in another domain you have self-help. You have the likes of Jordan Peterson, who popularized philosophical concepts, and people tend to gravitate to them. So there is a demand for sort of encountering concepts that are somewhat abstract, like meaning, sense of existence, these things. But it's rare that people orient themselves these days toward the work of actual philosophy. And I think it's a shame, and I think that in many ways it can be related to two main processes that really came to a head and became overwhelming in many ways in the 20th century. And what's really interesting is that these two processes are in many ways completely opposite in terms of the schools that they are attached to. One we could associate with the postmodern school, a continental school of philosophy, and the other one I think we could attach to the analytic school as a whole. And obviously the analytic school and the postmodern school are very, very opposed in terms of their programs, in terms of their agendas, in terms of their interests, in terms of what they believe constitutes exciting, good philosophy in the contemporary world, let's say. And I think that in a way, although they both are very influential in my own thinking, and I think they're tremendously interesting approaches, broad approaches, I think that in a way they could be seen as partly responsible for this decrease. I think it's a decrease of interest in philosophy as such, as a discipline that has relevance in people's lives. Notwithstanding other qualities, just relevance in people's lives. How important do people think that philosophy is? Now, why do I think that these two broad approaches have contributed to these decrease? I think that the reason why is because they have, each in their own way, contributed to the damaging to the prestige of the concept of a philosophical system. in a lot of my philosophy videos, although I have not made one that's specifically about the concept of a philosophical system, I tend to refer to a philosophical system in almost all of my philosophy videos. And I think the reason why I refer to it is because I am myself very preoccupied or occupied by this concept. At the same time, I have not really made a video specifically about it. I think at this stage I could make one. Until recently, I didn't really want to make one about it. Probably because I felt like I would be better positioned to make an interesting video on the concept of the system once I had completed my own system. You know, that once I had managed, or at least in my opinion, or the opinion of other people, managed to complete a system to a reasonable degree of so-called completion. And these days I'm close to it, with open monism, so I think that I could talk about it. Nevertheless, here the point I would like to make is that there's a connection between the concept of a philosophical system and the potential of philosophy to influence people's lives, to be embraced by people, for philosophy to, just as a result of this, become relevant again and be part of the conversation, the cultural conversation. It's rare these days for philosophy to be part of the conversation. When you show up at an event, any kind of event or a gathering, or whatever, and you talk about philosophy, you're very likely, at least that's how I experience it, and my acquaintances, the people that I spend time with, they're pretty educated people a lot of the time. You still come across as an alien a little bit, and I think that if the concept of system was more influential and had more regained prestige these days, maybe the situation will be different. And with open monism, I'm kind of trying to resuscitate the concept of system. So I guess what would be interesting to discuss would be why I think that the concept of system would help philosophy, at least in terms of its cultural relevance in people's lives, but also why I think that postmodernism on the one hand and the analytic school, which is older than postmodernism on the other hand, have contributed to its not, if not its demise, at least its relative state of being moribund. It's not quite dead, but it's not in great shape. And it could be resuscitated, I think, and I'm hoping to contribute at my very modest level to that. And there are other thinkers certainly that have a sort of system, and surprise, surprise, they tend to be quite popular with people. Like Alain Badiou and others, but not going to get into that discussion because otherwise the video will be too long. So I guess maybe let's first talk about why I think a system, a philosophical system, not just a single philosophical system, but the notion, the very idea of a philosophical system, could contribute to the renewed influence of philosophy. Well, I think because first of all, it's only really in philosophy as a discipline that you can pretend or attempt to develop a system that explains everything. It does not explain the detail of everything, but it purports to explain the principle, metaphysical principle behind the whole of reality. Usually a system aims at that. It aims at saying, this is the system, so you lay it out, it can be complex, but once you have laid it out, it should explain the meaning of being, it should explain the meaning of knowledge, it should explain the meaning of ethics, aesthetics, language, logic, everything. Everything can be explained by means of reference to this broad system. And you might say, but why should we embrace it? And why would it be true, for instance? And the thing is, I think that what's good about the concept of a system is that it proposes to offer a picture of reality that is different than the picture that is usually offered, and that contains its own logic and that is internally consistent. And the question is not so much why is it true, but rather why not propose to view the way the world works in that way. So imagine that you're looking at a painting that represents, say, like a cathedral, right? A French cathedral like Monet loves to paint them. Well, he's an impressionist, so he will have an impressionistic approach to the depiction of the cathedral, say the Cathedral of Rouen, for instance. Well, if you had a painter who was more in a more classical vein, he would paint it differently. You'd still recognize the cathedral. You could have an expressionist painter. You could have an abstract expressionist painter. You could have a Fauvist painter. You could have a futurist artist. You could have so many different. You could have a cubist artist or a surrealist painter, and each of them would represent the cathedral in its own way. Now, maybe the question which one is more truthful here is not so much of interest. Maybe the what's of interest mostly is not the representation of the cathedral and of what it means for a human being to experience the cathedral. Is it not greatly enriched by all these different yet coherent in themselves ways of representing it in painting? Well, if you consider the whole of reality or the whole of the universe or the world or whatever you call it, you could consider that like a philosophical system is not necessarily vying for describing reality with a greater or lesser level of truthfulness than another one, but more being the equivalent of what an expressionistic painting of a cathedral would be, or an impressionistic one, or an abstract one, or a cubist one, etc., etc. And thereby just get to understand the nature of reality better through the benefit of all these different perspectives that are very ambitious in their reach, but at the same time they are also they are also potentially promising a lot of benefit in terms of adding meaning to our experience of reality. So the purpose would not be necessarily truth in the scientific sense, but in enhancing and broadening and enriching the meaning of what of the world to us, or enriching the descriptions of the complex meaning that our experience of the world and of being holds for us. And I think that people could relate to it because it would be ambitious. So instead of being faced with works of postmodernism that tell you that, and I think that's the reason why they have contributed to the great diminishing of the prestige of the philosophical system, the postmodernists would say, well, meta-narratives ought to be rejected, truth is subjective, or truth is relative, or truth is whatever. Therefore, any work of philosophy that purports to explain everything is bound to be it's bound to be stricken by its own contradictions, and it suffices to deconstruct it to show that, and therefore a work of postmodernism is going to constantly be in a critical mode. So it's a work of postmodernism is not a work that proposes a positivity in a way. It doesn't propose something that you can embrace, think about, let sit within you, seep into you, and add meaning to your life as a result. Postmodern work is usually going to give you a useful critical lens on the world, but it's not going to add positive meaning to your life. And I think that in a way something is going to be lacking at some point, whereas it would not be lacking in the case of a system, because it would offer you a new picture rather than a critical lens on all the pictures, which is very nice, but it's not enough to have a meaning for life. On the other hand, the analytic school would say the problem with the philosophical systems is that they purport to explain explain existence, or explain the universe, or explain being in this very sweeping fashion in terms of everything relating back to the system, but many parts are inevitably going to be either untrue or most of the time not falsifiable. And this emphasis on falsifiability echoes the interest of the analytical philosophers in trying to bring philosophy as close as possible to the rigor of a science. Therefore, saying anytime the spectrum of the contributions that philosophy can make ought to be reduced significantly, but the contributions that it does make will have the solidity of a scientific discovery or a scientific resolution of a problem. And that's all very good, but the thing is, again, this is assuming that the philosophical system aims at discovering what is true, rather than enriching the different pictures of what is the case. We can say being is the case, reality is the case. Let's look at different ways in which it can be represented that are in themselves coherent, but not the only possibility to represent the reality. But in order to do that, you need to assume that there is such a thing as reality and that there is such a thing as being, and this is going to be in itself based on a certain set of propositions that are not in themselves falsifiable. You take them to be the case. You take them as an inductive hypothesis. And the thing is, you're going to be doing a lot of that when you investigate the nature, the metaphysical nature of reality or being or whatever, ontology. And this, which is always going to be within a system, the core of it, the metaphysics of it, is going to displease an analytic philosopher, because the analytic philosopher will say, but what about all this vagueness or all this obscurity, or they have different terms for it. Like, can we not just focus on works that contain propositions that can be shown to be meaningful and true? But the fact of the matter is, if you want to explore the nature of reality, you cannot only focus on the meaningful and the true. You have to look at everything and make assumptions. And if some of what you say is not concerned with the truth, in a way it doesn't matter, because what you aim for is a fuller description of what it is, what it means to be in a universe, what it means to have knowledge, to have feelings, to have a system of ethics, And in a way, I think that with the exception of a few charismatic and very, very important analytic philosophers, the analytic school is kind of a school that's restricted to those who know a lot about what the school does, technically speaking, and it's not going to be available to the broader audience because it is so technical and dry in a way, and limits its scope to like just logic and language really, and mind to some extent, but it doesn't really, and ethics, but it doesn't really look at it doesn't really look very much at aesthetics. It doesn't look very much at metaphysics. It's opposed to it in many ways, and the fact of the matter is, if you're opposed to the study of metaphysics, if you think that this is bound to be either vague or meaningless, you're essentially opposed to the possibility of having a system, because a system is going to be based on a metaphysical grounding framework from which all the other parts are going to follow. And so both the postmodern school and the analytic school are going to, and have sort of fought against the prevalence of philosophical systems, and it's become rarer to use philosophical systems these days. And for the reasons that I explained earlier, I think that this makes people feel like either when they read a work of philosophy these days, either the work brings a positivity, but it is like a technical, logical positivity that they find it hard to embrace because of its nomenclature, it's so foreign, it's so alien. And on the other hand, they have works that are often even harder to understand because they don't make a lot of sense according to a lot of people, the postmodern works, but also supposing that it can be understood, supposing that they, that people can understand what they're saying, they don't really bring a positivity because their lens is critical, and so they sharpen your perceptive apparatus supposedly, but they don't bring new things to look at. And I think both perspectives are useful, but if they are the only perspectives, and if the concept of system is sort of jettisoned or left aside, the consequence is going to be that relevance of philosophy to the culture, to people's lives, is going to be lessened, because people demand meaning, they demand pictures of reality that they can choose to embrace or not to embrace, and that demands their visions of reality to be as rich as possible, to have as many pictures as possible. And that's why the concept of system, I think, is important, and why in Open Monism I try to resuscitate it, I try to revive it, whilst at the same time taking into account contributions from analytic philosophy, which is why in Open Monism often my method operates via analysis of linguistic propositions, but by no means only that, but it does that. So taking into account the linguistic turn and all these things, and at the same time even considering that the influence of postmodern philosophy cannot be overlooked, because for those who are familiar with Open Monism, the concept of truth in it is also quite peculiar. Although it is not postmodern, it does take into account the positivity in nonsense, in a certain sense, that you could take as a postmodern insight. Anyway, that was for my perspective on systems. See you soon, guys.